Morning, Mark. Welcome back to our podcast, Satyam Vada. And this was a long time due. I was hoping that you'd come, and finally we are here. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation and being here. So to start in a very informal manner, के चल्दैछ, how is everything? We just finished दसैँ and तिहार हैन, कस्तो भयो, के भयो, के भयो. It must be a little different from what it used to be, right? Because in a new environment right now. So कस्तो भयो हजुरको दसैँ तिहार हैन?
Oh, by new environment you mean the newly married life?
Yeah, exactly. I'm sad about that though.
So thank you for having me, Syed. I know this. Perhaps this was the morning when all of this was supposed to happen. Newly married life is going good. I missed a couple of classes about which I am sad because now I have to rush through the syllabus real quick. But the students were very gracious. They allowed me to take a leave, and with the festival, I was able to unwind and reflect. But it feels like a breeze. You're floating, but really not knowing where you're headed. All in a good way. But I haven't had the chance to sit down and reflect what has happened. And that has mostly been my case since the past couple of years. I find myself in places. And then when I'm there, I sit and I reflect. But before time comes to absorb it, I'm already in another place.
So you never have this sort of in a mental space where you're like, अब चाहिँ म यो गर्छु अथवा अब चाहिँ म यस्तो गर्छु. You just let it flow.
I let it flow, and that was one reason why I was very active in social media, was to reflect on my everyday situation, post pictures, interact with students and my juniors and my friends and seniors. But that was too much scheduling of my time. So then I got rid of all my social media now. That has been a unique experience because now I'm just accountable to nothing. And that lack of accountability towards time has been interestingly liberating. So I can do some things, actually do nothing at most times. And that is, but you would think that I have a lot of time despite not having social media. Sadly, I don't. And I can't give you a calculation of how I've spent my day. I just seem to float around, and I'm trying to figure out what that is.
It's really interesting. You talk about social media, you know. When especially our generation, we're so much into consumption of social media, right? In fact, me as well. I reached college, and as soon as I was connected to the Wi-Fi, the first thing I checked was my messenger. And a lot of people do that. We go back home, and the first thing we do is tap into social media. Be it any form, Instagram, Facebook, or any other form of social media, right? So how do you see this? Like, there's so much of consumption of social media. Do you see it as a good thing? Do you see it as a bad thing? And how personally has it affected you on, not the liberation kind of sense or, your time scheduling, but then have you seen other positive or negative impacts?
Right. So, assuming that the audience of this podcast is mostly law students from KSL and perhaps from outside KSL, as a teacher, I think not using social media was good for me because I was consuming a lot of information about students that I frankly didn't need to know about. And as a teacher, as a judge, as a professional, sometimes with a little bit of information, it helps you be more bias-free. Frankly, you don't need that information. If someone's writing something negative on social media, तपाईँ क्लासमा आइसकेपछि तपाईलाई उसको बारेमा यसले यस्तो लेख्ने गरे रहेछ भन्ने थाहा हुने बित्तिकै राम्रो शिक्षकले के गर्छ भने त्यो मलाई बायस पूर्वाग्रह आइराछ भनेर थाहा पाउँछ, उसले ठ्याक्क त्यही बेला आफूलाई रोक्न पनि सक्छ. हामी बायस त हामीमा भइहाल्छ. तर मानौ कुनै दिन मेरो दिन राम्रो चलिरहेको छैन, म पनि मान्छे नै हो, मैले त्यो पूर्वाग्रहलाई चाहिँ म्यानेज गर्न सक्ने अवस्था छैन भने त ग्यारेन्टी छैन नि मैले त्यो बायसलाई चाहिँ राइट वेमा युज गरिरहन्छु भन्ने त ग्यारेन्टी छैन. सो आई थट एज अ टिचर वाइ डोन्ट आई लिमिट द्याट इन्फर्मेसन द्याट आम कन्ज्युमिङ अबाउट माई पियर्स, अबाउट माई कलिग्स, अबाउट माई स्टुडेन्ट्स because we live in a bubble, and a lot of the people who are friends with you on social media are mostly professionals, very few relatives. We generally don't add
Yeah,
relatives on
don't.
social media for obvious reasons, very justified. But it helped me not knowing. There are people who come to me and say, okay, did you see this on social media? XYZ wrote this on social media. And I say, is that information going to enhance my teaching ability, or is it going to reduce it? So consumption for me as a teacher has been, reducing that has been a good thing personally. Now, I don't judge patterns and behavior, because I've gone through a wave where I was an active social media user. You've probably seen some of my posts. There were 700 posts at a minimum, posting every day, interacting with students. So I went through that wave. I rode that wave. It's past me now for a while. So I don't know, maybe I will come back. So I don't judge, but you should listen to yourself when you're in that brief moment, when you're in the shower, when you're riding a bus to college. Is there a voice that tells you, why am I doing this? Who am I doing this for? When I'm going somewhere, would I go to that place if I didn't have my phone with me? If you would say, I probably wouldn't go for that trek without my phone, because I wouldn't have the camera and photos, then you should probably ask yourself at that point, perhaps a very big motivation for me to go there is to bring something back for the world to see, which is not bad in itself. Who am I to judge, right? But that's what I felt, and practically everything I was doing was to bring something back to the world to consume, and very less for myself. I was seeking validation at every level, even from students, and that was not a good idea for me. Yeah.
Interestingly, so a lot of people, including me, when I decide that, or when I even consider that, I'll stay off social media. Like, I'll totally get off. What I have is for fear of missing out.
Yeah.
Okay, and a lot of times, how I will justify continuing using social media is केसलको group chat so त्यसमा के important information आयो भने or something like that, like, and it's not the reason to do that, because I have such friends that they'll text me that is this the boy, but then I always justify that, saying that it's in KSL important information miss out boy or something like that. Did you have that when you went off social media or anything?
No FOMO. Thankfully, because I wasn't a student. I think your concern is very genuine, and organizations have to do a better job at notice dissemination. I think the primary source can never be social media. But with COVID, in a post-pandemic world, all the institutions, not just in Nepal, have relied on social media and pages to disseminate information, which I think should have been secondary to begin with. So even if I didn't have social media, I should have access to information, and we're continuously learning. As a coordinator for first year, I've learned every step of the way how to communicate better. So I rely on mostly good old emails. But even then, I feel lazy about sending emails, so I just drop something on Microsoft Teams or whatever. So I think whatever you're going through is very legitimate, because we are using that platform as a source of information. So you're right in thinking you will miss out on something.
Right.
Definitely.
So, when we were in the first year, right, our means of communication used to be Viber, and we could have a chat at any given time, right? And at any moment, anybody found something interesting, we used to just send it, and we used to have a good conversation. It was really, sometimes funny, sometimes serious, something like that. And we used to have a lot of debates as well. And in a sense, I liked it, because there was always this interesting perspective which was coming on from different students. Right now, you're off social media, so how does the current first year take it, or how?
I don't even have a Viber. Just for info, I used to entertain private messages on Viber, respond directly to the students. There are pros and cons. I think it was good for the students, not so good for the teacher. So I'm thinking of a way to balance that. How do I make sure that I am available? But also, there was this anxiety of sorts of, is there something I should be doing right now that I'm not doing? and it started taking a mental toll on myself as a teacher. So when I know at the back of my head there are messages I have to respond to. Now, one could legitimately argue, if that's the kind of anxiety you can't deal with, why take up that position to begin with? Why become an administrator? That's a good question I ask myself. And there have been times where I've asked, perhaps I'm not fit for the job. But then again, I can't guarantee that if I go to any other position or job, this won't happen to me again. So I've been trying to find a way to communicate in a manner which makes me less anxious, which leaves me open to communicate. But also, it's probably the fatigue they call after post-pandemic, the online fatigue, the communicating with texts. And I've never been good at text. So I love meeting people. Scheduling becomes challenging, but just walking past, sitting in the canteen. I love sitting in the canteen, not because I have to order something. I just know that someone will pass by me and they'll just drop in for a chat. And I like now to do things that way. So this is an open invitation to all my friends and my students that if you see me around with a coffee or even with just a book, that means I want you to come and talk to me. That book is just there as a pretense. So yeah.
Right. But I have the same thing. If more than 2 people are texting me at the same time, I will feel anxiety like anything, right? And I'll not be able to decide whom to reply first. And that's something that I've struggled with. So I just ignore the messages completely. And after like an hour or 2, and then I'll reply to them because, I just don't want to deal with that anxiety at the moment. But then given the topic of anxiety, ma'am, you were a student yourself, and being a law student, you know what the current generation of law students, the problems that we go through and things like that, and especially with in a post-COVID world, right? Frankly, during the COVID, right, I felt like I was very static. I was not growing. I was not consuming information. I was not learning anything or anything like that, especially even during my enrollment in college itself. Right. So are there any suggestions you would want to give to students, or, how you dealt with things back then, right, which could help us or current law students to deal with anxiety and other forms of, mental problems?
Yeah, this is an emotional question. So, how they say, रुनु पर्यो भने भावनाको कुरा गर्नु पर्यो भने चाहिँ आफ्नै भाषामा गर्दाखेरि मजा आउँछ भने जस्तै म र मेरो दिदी हामी यही कलेजमा पढ्यौँ, काठमाडौँ स्कुल अफ ल. मेरो बुवा र आमा फाउन्डर संस्थापकहरूमध्ये 2 जना हुनुहुन्थ्यो. हामी धेरै सानो थियौँ. 2001 मा जब यो भक्तपुरमा आयो, जग हालेको पनि हामीले देखेको हो. यहाँ वरिपरि तपाईहरुको टोयलेट सफा गर्ने दिदीहरू, क्यान्टिनमा सफा गर्ने दिदीहरू, सबै उहाँहरू पहिला महिला कामदार हुनुहुन्थ्यो. उहाँहरू ज्यालादारी गर्नुहुन्थ्यो. दिदी भन्दा भन्दै, अङ्कल भन्दा भन्दै ल पढ्ने बेला आयो. र ल पढ्ने बेला आइसकेपछि एउटा महत्त्वपूर्ण प्रश्न उठ्यो. अब ल नै पढ्ने हो भने त्यति बेला 5 वर्षे LL.B प्रोग्राम काठमाडौँ स्कुल अफ ल बाहेक, पूर्वाञ्चल विश्वविद्यालयको KSL बाहेक अरू कहीँ पनि थिएन. त्यही भएर मेरो दिदीलाई र मलाई पढ्ने बेलामा एउटा प्रश्न के थियो भने, अब तिमीले कि पढ्नलाई ल पढ्ने हो भने KSL मै पढ्नुपर्छ, आफ्नै आमा र बुवा शिक्षक भएको कलेजमा पढ्नुपर्छ, नत्र भने इन्डिया अथवा बाहिर जानुपर्छ. एउटा हुन्छ नि, जस्तो तपाईले केही सामान बेचिरहनु भएको छ भने तपाईकै घरको मान्छेले त्यो सामान प्रयोग गरेन भने त्यो सामान राम्रो हो कि होइन, त्यसको गुणस्तरको बारेमा मान्छेले के सोच्छ भन्ने एउटा हुन्छ. सायद मेरो आमा बुवा अहिले शिक्षक पनि, उहाँहरूले के सोच्नु भयो भने यत्रो कलेज खोलेको छ, समाजप्रति उत्तरदायी भनेर अलिकति कानुनी शिक्षालाई आधुनिकीकरण गर्ने भनेर यसरी कलेज खोलेको छ, आफ्नै छोरीहरूलाई आफैले पढाउने कलेजमा पढाएन भने त अरूले आफ्नो छोराछोरीलाई के विश्वासको आधारमा यहाँ ल्याउने भन्ने सायद त्यो प्रश्न थियो होला. र मलाई पनि लाग्यो आफूले त आफ्नो आमा बुवाले मेहनत गरेको देखेको छ, उहाँको साथीहरू अङ्कल आन्टीहरूले मेहनत गरेको देखेको छ. त्यो देखिसकेपछि मलाई पनि यही पढ्छु भन्ने लाग्यो. मलाई 1 मिनेटको लागि पनि म बाहिर जानुपर्छ भन्ने. हुन त त्यो मैले के सोचेको थिएँ, आउने बित्तिकै एउटा ठुलो प्रब्लम, आफ्नै आमा बुवालाई कक्षामा देख्दाखेरि सर म्याम भन्दाखेरि त्यो बानी कसरी लगाउने, है त्यसले धेरै अप्ठ्यारो हुन्छ तपाईहरुको 1 2 मा नै यदि म्याथ्स साइन्स पढाउने मम्मी ड्याडी हुनुहुन्थ्यो भने पनि मेरो बाल्यकालले मेरो सक्यो चाइल्डहुड वाज रुइन्ड भन्ने जस्तो तपाईहरु कुरा गर्नुहुन्छ हामी त कस्तो भने 16 17 18 को टाइममा हामी यस्तो ठाउँमा आयौं फाइदा थियो म फाइदा थिएन भन्दिन किनभने हामी त्यो कल्चरबाट हुर्केर आयौं आमा बुवाले भनिरहेको कारणले यो केएसएल को बारेमा मलाई सबै कुरा अलरेडी थाहा थियो तर बेफाइदाको कुरा गर्दाखेरि के हो भने पटक पटक मेरो दिदी र मलाई हाम्रो दिमागमा कुरा खेल्न थाल्यो नराम्रो गर्यो भने सरको छोरी म्यामको छोरी त्यही पनि नराम्रो गर्यो अटेन्डेन्स बिगार्यो भने सरको छोरी म्यामको छोरी त आएन हामी किन आउने एक खालको हामी बेन्चमार्क बन्यौं उतातिर राम्रो गर्यो भने सरको म्यामको छोरी अनि त राम्रो गर्यो होला नि भन्ने त्यही भएर हामीसँग नराम्रो गर्ने अप्सन थियो नराम्रो गर्ने अप्सन थियो हामी बढी कसरी सोच्यौं भने राम्रो गर्दै जानुपर्छ र यो कलेजबाट बाहिरको ठाउँहरुमा गएर कता कता हामीले राम्रो काम गर्न सक्छौं त्यहाँ देखाएर अरूलाई ल हेर तिमीले भनिरहेथ्यौ नि सर र म्यामको छोरी भएको कारणले यस्तो पायो भनेर ल हेर यो मुटकोटमा हामी भोका थियौं हामी खोजी खोजी बाहिर खोज्दै हिँड्यौं यहाँको पढाइबाट मात्र सीमित भएनौं किनभने हामीलाई त्यो अप्सनै थिएन तर गर्दा 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 अहिले म सोचिरहेको छु सायद त्यति बेला पहिल्यैदेखि मान्छेको भोक मेटाउने प्रवृत्ति आएको कारणले मैले अघि भने नि यो भ्यालिडेसनको कुरा त्यो बानी बन्यो त्यो बानी बन्दा 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 अब 10 वर्ष 20 देखि 30 को उमेरसम्ममा मैले त्यही नै गरिरहेँ यहाँ पढेको बाहिर राम्रो पढ्न पाउँछु कि पाउँदिन भन्ने चीजमा पनि आफैलाई पुश गरेर अरूले के भन्छ भन्ने सोच्दै 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 त्यो एक हिसाबले राम्रै थियो किनभने हामीलाई त्यसले प्रेरणा पनि दियो गर्नुपर्छ कुद्नुपर्छ अलि बाक्लो छालाको बनायो मान्छेले कतै केही भन्दैमा हामी नरुने इनफ्याक्ट हाम्रो साथीहरु मजाले बसेर अब अलिअलि कुरा काट्छन् नि टिचरहरुको कुरा काट्ने आफ्नै आमा बुवाको कुरा काट्दा पनि म त्यसलाई अन्यथा नलिकन हाँसेर उडाउँथे र मेरो लागि सफलता तब थियो जब मेरो साथीहरु आफैले बेला बेला बसेर गसिप गर्नुहुन्थ्यो किनभने उहाँहरुलाई थाहा थियो म लगेर पछाडी घरमा भन्दिन त्यो विश्वास मैले कमाए मेरो दिदीले कमाउनु भयो त्यही भएर अरूले सोचे जस्तो सजिलो पनि थिएन अरूले सोचे जस्तो गाह्रो पनि थिएन बा सरको छोरी कस्तो गाह्रो होला भन्ने पनि थिएन इन दैट सेन्स इट वाज रियली नर्मल बट लाइक आई सेड देयर इज अ ह्याबिट that I have developed which was because of my exposure to KSL which I carried outside KSL when I went abroad. I always saw my teachers as father figure mother figure and I always wanted to make them happy and I burned out especially in the last couple of years. That's a lot to take in.
A lot to take in.
Yeah.
You talked about how the unsaid pressures हुन्थ्यो नि that हुन्छ नि युवराज सरको अथवा गीता आमको छोरीहरु भनेर right there's also a sense of what people might feel is that हुन्छ नि are teachers going to be biased or something like that. So on the question of biasness, I know that I'm your favorite student, but that's a top secret. I know. But then how do you or हुन्छ नि how are you able to see that I'm getting biased data, I should take a step back, or how do you ensure that you're not being biased in class?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So here's what I say. It's not possible for us to not be biased at all. Ideally, that's what we would want to say about ourselves, but the goal is to recognize your bias, lay it out on the table. What I've started doing with my students is just to say, look, this is my bias. When I teach jurisprudence in first year with these students, I generally now, this year I've started saying, you will probably notice my affinity, my likeness towards certain jurists compared to others. And before you start wondering whether this jurist is her favorite jurist, why don't I just tell you, look, malai yo school of thought man parcha badi. त्यो भन्ने बित्तिकै अब मलाई च्यालेन्ज के हो भने अब मैले बायसको बारेमा डिक्लेयर गरे बायस त हुन्छ नि तर अब डिक्लेयर गरिसकेपछि एउटा खालको सम्बन्ध बन्छ विद्यार्थी र टिचरको बीचमा त्यही भएर सकेसम्म टिचरले आफ्नो बायस मेरो यो हो भन्दिदा नै राम्रो हुने रहेछ किनभने अब हामी पहिला के सोच्थ्यौं भने विद्यार्थीलाई हाम्रो बारेमा जति धेरै थाहा भयो उले त्यो सूचना त्यो इन्फर्मेसन हाम्रो विरुद्ध प्रयोग गर्छ भन्ने एउटा खालको सोचाइ थियो अब मेरो विचार के छ र यहाँ थुप्रै टिचरहरु त्यस्तो हुनुहुन्छ जो सहमत हुनुहुन्छ हामी यही क्याफेटेरियामा बसेर यही कुरा गरिरा हुन्छौं अब विद्यार्थीले हाम्रो बारेमा इन्फर्मेसन थाहा पाउँदैमा हाम्रो विरुद्ध प्रयोग गर्छन् भन्ने मनसाय पहिला नराखौँ. लेट्स गो विथ गुड फेथ. पहिला प्रिजम्पसन अफ गुड फेथ गरौँ, अनलेस दे प्रुभ अस अदरवाइज. एउटा अपराधी अभियुक्तलाई त हामी बेनिफिट अफ डाउट दिन्छौँ भने स्टुडेन्ट्स आर जस्ट ह्युमन्स, दे आर गोइङ थ्रु देयर ओन च्यालेन्जेस. सो द्याट्स हाउ आई थिङ्क आई विल डिल विथ इट. बट बायस चाहिँ हुन्छ. जस्तो कहिलेकाहीँ केही कुरा गर्दाखेरि मनमा चिरिक्क हान्छ विद्यार्थीले किन यस्तो भनिदिएको होला. अनि म चाहिँ विद्यार्थीहरूलाई गाली नखाउन् भनेर उनीहरूलाई बचाउन खोज्थेँ. तपाईँहरूलाई थाहा छैन ओरिएन्टेसनमा यसो गर, यसो नगर, यसो गर, यसो नगर भनेर म भन्थेँ बेस्ड अन माई एक्सपिरियन्स. मेरो इन्ट्रेस्ट के थियो भने उनीहरूलाई कुनै पनि उनीहरूले गाली खानु नपरोस्, 5 वर्ष आनन्दले उनीहरूले कलेजबाट निस्केर जान पाउन् भन्ने मलाई लाग्ने. अनि मैले सोचेँ, तर मलाई त त्यस्तो भनिदिने कोही पनि थिएन. मैले त लड्दै पढ्दै गाली खाँदै उठ्दै थचारिँदै अगाडि गएको. सो the fundamental question is, do you have a right to struggle or not? If you have a right to struggle, I should not protect you from that struggle. You should fall, you should find out on your own. But my nature is, because I am personally connected with this institution, sometimes when students raise valid criticisms, I get very defensive and I try to do unnecessary damage control. And I go back home and I think, did I have to do that? It's just an institution that is growing and there will be problems. Why did I have to take it so personally? It probably is because I see the same staff who set up this institution, and I take things a bit more personally. So I'm trying to deal with that now.
No, I think it's very genuine because before COVID, right, I started this garment with business, and COVID hit and it was in Tamil, so I had to pay a lot of rent. Right, but then I was not ready to let go of that shop. The showroom, I let go of money. To a point where I asked money from my father because let's pay. It will go off. But then after that, lockdown, there were no tourists at all, and it was entirely like the touristish business school. Something which saved me was I went for residential. And the 10 days of being in a very different environment, when I was coming back, and boss mama realized, I think it's time to let it go. And I realized this, when people used to come up and tell me that, I think you should let it go. You're just like 18, 19. You don't have to go on, take on businesses and everything. But then I used to get very defensive about it because I started it myself, and it was like I'd seen the entire journey, right? So I was not ready to let it go. So I think sort of I resonate what you're trying to see there. But then being a teacher, what you said, and this word being a teacher, you also open yourself to a lot of presumptions, or students assume something based on what you're teaching, right? A lot of times what would happen is, just because you're teaching Marxism, people would assume that yes, your teacher is a Marxist, right? If you criticize Marxism just in pure academic sense, and they'll just say they are a capitalist or something like that, right? So just the sense of what's a very prominent misunderstanding that your students have had for a long period of time, like your only consistent misunderstanding, and would you want to clear it?
Misunderstanding, that's a really difficult question. I have never asked any of my students, in what sense have you misunderstood me? I do want to say here out front is, I think our batch in KSL, no offense to our friends or anything, was the most disruptive batch in terms of discipline. We have bullied teachers to a point where they quit a year later saying, teaching is not my cup of tea. I don't want to name that teacher. Another teacher kicked the furniture and said, I'm never coming back to your class. That has never happened to me or any of my colleagues here, as far as I hear. So the thing is, it's so easy to forget that, right? When you become a teacher, you forget who you were as a student.
Right.
Only recently I've started openly admitting this to my students. Look, whatever you do, you probably won't top what we did. And a sense of something that I've noticed is when you said I'm your favorite student, right? And we had a little laugh.
Yeah.
The misunderstanding here, I think, which is likely in my case, is people not understanding my sense of humor. I'm terribly frightened about that because with cancel culture, things being blown out of proportion, I don't know what kind of sense of humor it is. At least it's funny to me. So I laugh when I say something funny. But and then I also explain it's humorous. You're supposed to laugh. So I basically say everything as we go just to not let people misunderstand. And I've realized that when you're funny, when you use sense of humor to take your message across, students don't take themselves very seriously and they don't take the teachers very seriously. A senior of yours wrote in a comment, what advice do you want to give to your juniors is something I asked. And she said, I would tell my juniors not to take themselves very seriously or the teachers very seriously. Now, here's where generation gap came. When I showed that comment to some other teachers, they would say, oh, what does this mean? You have to take teachers seriously. So they took it on a different level. They did not understand the context. What the senior meant was, don't take the teachers seriously to a point that a single comment from the teacher breaks your ego or shatters you. So this linguistic use of taking someone seriously has a very different tone than how people used to understand it. So just explaining these cultural things is very important. Sometimes Google Classrooms is very popular. People like to vent their anger and frustration. And I generally defend the colleagues and my teachers. But a student commented, this was bomb, or this was epic, or some words which, let's say the class was bomb. That has a very different connotation for someone who doesn't understand that that's probably a compliment.
Right.
Or I don't want to use that word, but S**T, good, that word, is probably a compliment for the younger generation. So it's difficult to communicate that with your colleagues. And that's where I think misunderstanding can come.
Right. I also realized this, like when we used to have class and I used to always explain your jokes and like, you know, me personally with a few of my friends, like the things on, we used to always wonder, like, was there an explanation needed? Because the joke is good until the other person does not explain it, right? Because then you're like, and now that you say that, it does make sense that, because humor is very contextual, right? It's subjective to people. Somebody may like something, somebody may not like something. So, right, an explanation is needed. But then let me get back to you on the cancel culture thing that you were talking about. We see a lot of it happening, and I personally, I don't have very firm opinions on a lot of things, but then something which I'm really not fine with is the current cancel culture. It's because I feel that the right of expression, be it anything, right, it has to be protected. And when people sort of move into this cancel culture thing, we're essentially saying that you don't have the right to say this or do this or something like that. So how do you view it?
It's fine. I think everyone is against cancel culture on a theoretical level, but you hold these ideas very dear. You don't want that to be cancelled. So everyone's operating on that level. जस्तो सिद्धान्तको रूपमा यो मान्छेलाई अभिव्यक्तिको स्वतन्त्रता छ, जे पनि बोल्न पाउनुपर्छ भन्ने चिज सबैले मान्छ, सबैले भन्छ पनि, तर एउटा ठाउँमा पुग्छ अनि त्यहाँ पुग्ने बित्तिकै त्यो चिजलाई गाली गर्यो भने चाहिँ त्यो स्वतन्त्रता छैन भन्ने त हो नि. सो क्यान्सल गर्नुपर्छ भन्ने त प्राय हुँदैन. अनि आफूलाई सोध्नुपर्ने प्रश्न चाहिँ के हो भने, त्यो कुन चिज हो जुन मलाई कसैले कुरा सोध्यो अथवा भन्ने बित्तिकै विद्यार्थी अथवा अरू कोही मेरो कान चिरिक्क हुने, अलिकति घाँटी सुक्खा भए जस्तो, गाला रातो भए जस्तो, त्यो आफैले पहिला उसले गर्नु अगाडि नै पत्ता लगायो भने त्यो कुरा छिटो पच्न सक्छ. जस्तो मेरो केसमा पहिला हामी हुँदाखेरि आफ्नै आमा र बुवालाई, तपाईँ सोच्नुहोस्, आफ्नै आमा बुवालाई कसैले कुनै कारणले होस् टिचरको रूपमा गाली गरेछ भने मलाई कति गाह्रो हुन्थ्यो होला. तर पहिल्यै जब मैले तयार गरेँ, उसले त आफ्नो टिचरलाई गाली गरे हो नि, अलिअलि टिचरलाई गाली गर्न त पाइहालिन्छ नि, दुर्व्यवहार गर्नु भएन, गाली बेइज्जती गर्नु भएन, डेफेमेसन गर्नु भएन। तर संसारको कुनै पनि संस्था छैन जहाँ विद्यार्थी टिचरसँग खुसी छन्। पछि गएर थाहा हुन्छ ए ठिकै रहेछ, अथवा पछि गएर पनि त्यति ठिकै थिएन भन्ने पनि होला। तर उसले अलिअलि आफ्नो फ्रस्ट्रेसन निकाल्नको लागि गाली गर्छ भने मैले के सोच्नु पर्यो भने उसले त्यो उसको शिक्षकलाई गाली गरेको, मेरो बुवालाई गाली गरेको होइन। अथवा गाली नै गरेको हो भने पनि उसको त बुवा होइन नि त, मेरो पनि बुवा हो त होइन। त्यो त्यसरी सोच्यो भने चाहिँ मैले त्यो प्र्याक्टिस गर्न थालेपछि मलाई 5 वर्ष सजिलो भयो, किनभने प्रशस्त त्यो आउँथ्यो पनि। इभन टुडे with a father and with mother who are probably amazing personalities in the legal field, to a point that it chills my sister and I, thinking no matter how hard we try, we would probably never reach that. It has set us on a path of liberation now. So we practically end up doing nothing other than drinking coffee on some days. So that has helped us a lot. So if you, Syed, just ask yourself, I'm okay with freedom of expression, but is there that one thing that I just can't tolerate? If you preempt it before you get to that point, perhaps you can manage it better. I like to now say that there's hardly, in my case, there's hardly any offensive remark. There's only offended people. Because if you set your mindset accordingly, you probably can take very good roasts. Now again, roasting is another culture that is very popular in Nepal among this generation, but should we apply it is another thing. So that's something we should be thinking about. I actually want to talk to you, Syed, about something that I've been thinking, which is the issue of language. In Kathmandu School of Law, we believe in diversity, linguistic diversity, ethnic diversity, and you probably went to the school where त्यो नेपालीमा बोल्यो भने कुट्ने स्कुलमा गयो, पनिशमेन्ट गर्ने स्कुल।
कुट्दैन थियो, we had to stay back and we had to write 100 times I will speak in English, I'll speak in English, I'll speak in English.
Right? So म पनि 90s kid,
right,
नेपाल काठमाडौँमै जन्मिएको, आमा बुवाले धेरै सङ्घर्ष देख्नुभयो। तर अब म खोला तरेर स्कुल गइन पकेटमा मकै राखेर भन्नुको अब त्यसले मलाई चाहिँ अलिकति अथोरिटी डाउन पार्दियो होला अरूको तुलनामा। तर ठिकै थियो, बाल्यकाल राम्रै थियो। अनि आमा बुवालाई के भयो भने अबको प्रतिस्पर्धा गर्ने समाजमा चाहिँ अलिकति इङ्ग्लिस राम्रो हुने स्कुलमा राख्नुपर्छ भनेर अहिले पनि थुप्रै आमा बुवाले छोराछोरीलाई इङ्ग्लिसमा राम्रो बनाउनुपर्छ भनेर यस्तो यस्तो स्कुल छानेर राख्नुभयो जहाँ इङ्ग्लिसमै बोल्न लगाउँथ्यो। अनि हामी त्यो वर्ड बिगारी आई एम आइङ खाइङ भनी पनि हामी इङ्ग्लिस सिक्यौँ। म आफैले पनि गाली खाइन्छ भनी इङ्ग्लिस सिक्यो। अब त्यसको समस्या एउटा के भयो भने हामी प्राय चिज सोच्दा पनि इङ्ग्लिसमा सोच्ने भइसक्यौँ। अब मेरो एउटा चुनौती च्यालेन्ज के हो भने नेपाली नराम्रो भएको होइन, मातृभाषा थाहा नभएको होइन, तर हुर्काइ नै त्यो खालको भयो कि जुन समाजमा तपाईँलाई आफ्नो भाषा बोल्दाखेरि स्कुलमा पिटिन्छ, गाली गरिन्छ। हाम्रो बेलामा त पिट्ने पनि एउटा कल्चर थियो। त्यो एडमिनिस्ट्रेसनलाई पनि के गाली गरौँ? अब आमा बुवाले नै छोरछोरीलाई फ्लुएन्ट बनाइदिए भनेर पठाएपछि त उसले त हामीले नबोल्दा गाली नै गर्थ्यो होला नि त। टिचरको पनि गल्ती छैन, उसलाई पनि ब्रेन वास भयो। सो जुन समाजमा आफ्नो भाषा बोल्दाखेरि गाली गरिन्छ त्यो समाजमा अहिले कस्तो अवस्था आयो भने तपाईँ र म इङ्ग्लिस नेपाली गरिरहेछौँ, तल एउटाले कमेन्टमा खुब जान्ने भइस्, अब विदेश पढेर आएको देखाइस्, बुर्जुवा इङ्ग्लिसमा बोलिस्, आफ्नो भाषा आउँदैन तँलाई। हेर्नुहोस्, लेख्नु पर्यो भने नेपालीमै बढी राम्रो लेखिन्छ। तर हाम्रो सोचाइ म सपना पनि इङ्ग्लिसमा देख्ने भइसकेँ। अब मैले नेपालीमा प्रष्ट बोल्छु भन्दाखेरि कनी सोच्नुपर्ने त्यो अवस्थामा हामीलाई पारिएको हो। त्यही भएर एउटा मेरो ठुलो चुनौती, अब हाम्रो क्लासमा नेपाली एकदम राम्रो भएको विद्यार्थी पनि हुनुहुन्छ, अथवा इङ्ग्लिस पनि धेरै स्ट्रङ नभएको, नेपाली पनि स्ट्रङ नभएको, अरू नै भाषामा बोल्ने साथीहरू पनि हुनुहुन्छ। त्यो एउटा चुनौती चाहिँ इङ्ग्लिसमै मात्र पढाउने कि नेपालीमा मात्र पढाउने कि मिसमास गऱ्यो भने फेरि इङ्ग्लिस राम्रो भयो न नेपाली राम्रो भयो भन्ने पनि आरोप आउँछ कि भने मलाई एउटा जहिले पनि टेन्सन, कति हदसम्म इङ्ग्लिस बोल्ने, कति हदसम्म नेपाली बोल्ने, नेपाली बोलिरहेको साथीलाई इङ्ग्लिसमा बढी प्रिपेयर गराउने, इङ्ग्लिस बोलिरहने साथीलाई नेपालीमा प्रिपेयर गराउने, यसको मैले समाधान पाएको छैन। सो म जहिले यो सोचिरहेको हुन्छु क्लासमा पनि। आई डोन्ट नो हाउ यु सी इट।
I am very I see it like हुन्छ नि that मलाई त बेसिक्सबाटै सिक्नुपर्छ जसले नि मैले टेक अन गरेको छु किन भन्दा आई स्टडिड इन एन इन्डियन बोर्ड एमआइएसमा अनि हाम्रो चाहिँ एउटा सर्टेन लेभलसम्म मात्रै हुन्थ्यो ल्याङ्ग्वेज अनि त्यतिखेर वी जस्ट स्टडिड इट टिल 7 होइन अनि त्यसपछि चाहिँ वी डि नट स्टडी इट होइन त्यसपछि 5 years इन्टायरली इन इङ्ग्लिस त्यसपछि 12सम्म राइट सो मैले त धेरै कुरा बिर्सिसकेको थिएँ एन्ड देन आई जोइन केएसएल अनि त्यसपछि देन इट बिकेम एभिडेन्ट टु मी द्याट हुन्छ नि यति धेरै कुरा बिर्सिसकेको रहेछु रस्सु दीर्घ यो कसरी लेख्ने त्यो कसरी लेख्ने भनेर एन्ड अब कस्तो पनि कल्चर छ भन्दाखेरि जस्ट बिकज यु युज मोर इङ्ग्लिस होइन एउटा अङ्ग्रेजी ग्याङ भनेर फर्म हुन्छ अनि त्यसै अर्को चाहिँ नेपाली ग्याङ भनेर फर्म हुन्छ अनि त्यसै त्यो अनसेट टेन्सन चाहिँ हुँदो रहेछ दुवैको बिचमा अनि अब फर्स्ट इयरमा त मलाई गाह्रो नै भएको हो सेकेन्ड इयरमा पनि इट्स अ बिट हार्ड तर आइम ट्राइङ टु इम्प्रुभ इट भनौँ होइन तर आई थिङ्क यु नो when I think of it at times like मलाई कस्तो पनि लाग्छ भन्दाखेरि यो त मेरो मदर टङ हो नि त आई सुड बी गुड एट इट होइन वाइ एम आई नट भनेर पनि लाग्छ एन्ड देन आई थिङ्क ब्याक एन्ड देन आई गेट इट लाइक हुन्छ नि हामीलाई त इङ्ग्लिस 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 मात्रै गरिएको थियो स्कुलमा भनेर right so that's a very
it's not your fault it's not your fault at all you were just sent to a school that prioritized English there are some students who went to schools where चाहँदै पनि इङ्ग्लिस राम्रो पढाउने टिचर थिएन अथवा त्यहाँ फोकस थिएन उहाँहरूको नेपाली धेरै राम्रो हुनसक्छ एटलिस्ट यो कलेजमा हामी के भन्छौँ क्लासमा भने तपाईँको नेपाली राम्रो छ त्यसलाई अगाडि लिएर जानुहोस् तर अब इङ्ग्लिस पनि अलिअलि सिक्नुहोस् राम्रो बनाउँदै जानुहोस् किनभने भाषा त हो जुन भाषा सिकेर जति एउटा धेरै भाषामा राम्रो बोल्न सक्यो त्यति राम्रो हो र भन्दै पनि अब यो उपनिवेशवादबाट निस्किएको समाजमा हामीलाई धेरै चिजलाई इङ्ग्लिस चाहिन्छ नै अब टोफेलमा कति स्कोर आयो भन्नेले तिमी मास्टर्स कहाँ पढ्न जाने भन्ने ब्यारियर छ त्यो हामीले बनाएको होइन भिसा पाउने नपाउने इङ्ग्लिस राम्रो बनाउनुहोस् तर इङ्ग्लिस राम्रो भएको साथीहरूलाई म क्लासमा पनि भन्ने गर्छु तपाईँको गल्ती होइन तर अब तपाईँको इङ्ग्लिस त अलरेडी राम्रो छ अलि बढी नेपाली साहित्यको किताबहरू र एउटा तरिका छ मलाई पनि हुन्छ मैले पनि ट्राई गर्ने चिज यो म आज पुरै दिन नेपाली नै बोल्छु भनेर मैले ठानेर बोलेँ भने मैले प्राय धेरै अङ्ग्रेजी शब्द मिसावट गर्दिनँ तर त्यसका लागि एउटा खालको चेतना हुनुपर्छ अब यही गर्न पनि मलाई सोच्नुपर्छ तर भोलिका दिनमा सायद हामीले 2टा 3टा 4वटा भाषाहरूमा हामी अलि बढी फरक बोल्न सक्ने भयो भने त्यो त राम्रो नै हो तर मेरो लागि चाहिँ सबैभन्दा ठुलो चुनौती र यो कसैले पनि कुरा नगर्ने पनि चिज यही नै हो कमेन्टमा पनि यही गाली क्लासमा पनि यही गाली इङ्ग्लिसमा पढाएन भने इङ्ग्लिस जान्दैन भनेर गाली नेपालीमा पढायो भने अब इङ्ग्लिसमा नेपालीमा पढाएन भने खुब जान्ने विदेशी आए भनेर भन्ने यो विद्यार्थीहरूको नर्मल फ्रस्ट्रेसन निकाल्ने एउटा माध्यम मात्र हो अब keeping that aside I think there's a lot to do in the upcoming future on that matter
एकदम what I practice is म चाहिँ केस निकाल्छु and then I just pick 10 words and the 10 words को meaning खोजेर आजको मेरो गोल चाहिँ आज दिनभरिमा यो 10वटा शब्द चाहिँ म कन्टिन्युअसली युज गर्दै जान्छु
give me one for example
शक्ति पृथक्तीकरण
oh nice very nice yeah
so I do that अनि तर कस्तो हुँदो रहेछ भन्दाखेरि the next day you forget the words that you remembered on the other day but then in conversation चाहिँ त्यो निस्किँदो रहेछ क्या अनि चाहिँ ऊ हुन्छ कि ए ओके यो बिर्सेको होइन रहेछ तर इट्स अन द ब्याक अफ माई माइन्ड भनेर होइन त्यसरी पनि इट्स फर्म अफ गुड प्र्याक्टिस
एन्ड पिपल डोन्ट रियलाइज दिस द्याट बट ल्याङ्ग्वेज इज द्याट वान थिङ when you have a concept, for example, you're talking about blue sky. If blue लाई नीलो भन्छ हामीले अनुवाद गर्यौं अथवा there are different words for the same thing. तर नेपाली vocabulary-मा त्यस्तो पनि शब्द हुन सक्छ जसले it cannot be translated well in English. So at any given time, when you have a concept in your mind, you can always think only in terms of one language. तपाईलाई कुन खालको समाजमा तपाईलाई हुर्काइयो, कस्तो वातावरण त्यसले फरक पार्छ. अहिले एटलिस्ट मलाई के चाहिँ लाग्छ भने आमा बुवाहरूले जो विद्यार्थीलाई जो आफ्नो छोराछोरीलाई राम्रो स्कुलमा हाल्नु भएको छ इङ्ग्लिस उनीहरूको राम्रो हुन्छ नै म चाहिँ के भन्छु भने एटलिस्ट घरमा चाहिँ नेपालीमा बोलिदिनुहोस् नेपालीमा मजाले बोल्यो भने पनि एकैचोटि उसले नेपाली शब्द नसोच्ला तर बोल्नु पर्यो भने बोल्छ तपाईँलाई मैले 5 मिनट पुरै नेपालीमा बोल्नुहोस् भनेर भनिरहे भने तपाईँले सक्नुहुन्छ तर हाम्रो अपब्रिङिङ यस्तो भयो कि खर्र बोल्दै जाँदाखेरि भित्र इङ्ग्लिस छिर्छ त्यसलाई हामीले अलिकति सुधार्नु पर्ने अवस्था छ भन्नु पर्ला
अनि मेरो घरमा त फेरि कस्तोमा भन्दाखेरि इट्स डिफरेन्ट लिङ्ग्विस्टिक्स क्या फेरि अब मम्मीसँग उर्दूमा बोल्यो ड्याडीसँग नेपालीमा बोल्ने भाइ always speaks in English because he's trying to learn like हुन्छ नि त्यो फेजमा छ कि हुन्छ नि he's just trying to learn new words and stuff he's reading books so he's just like fluent होस् भनेर होइन अनि there's just 3 language that goes on क्या अनि अब कहिले काहीँ कस्तो हुन्छ भन्दाखेरि मम्मीसँग नेपालीमा बोलिदिन्छु लाइक केही सोध्नु भयो भने अनि ड्याडीसँग उर्दूमा बोलिदिन्छु अनि त्यसपछि रियलाइज हुन्छ ए होइन उर्दू गर्नुपर्ने थियो भनेर देन इट्स अ भेरी इन्ट्रेस्टिङ हो क्या वेन all 3 people in your house use different language to communicate होइन अनि त्यतिखेर अब sometimes what happens is मम्मीले केही भनेको हुन्छ त्यसपछि ड्याडले केही सोध्नुहुन्छ होइन so I think in Urdu but I reply in Nepali so it also makes your mind more like हुन्छ नि critical or you know on the feet अलि thinking छिटो हुन्छ भनेर जस्तो पनि लाग्छ क्या when you use different languages think in a different language speak in a different language so this is interesting so I did a little bit of research about that but then yeah it was interesting what I want to get back to you is and you said that when your parents are such big figures in legal world right that you see that त्यतिसँग त नपुगेला जस्तो but then when the first time I heard about you and I was like okay Harvard graduate भनेर होइन and then like you Swechhya is Yuvraj सरको छोरी भनेर I was like of course who else would reach Harvard भनेर भयो क्या मलाई right so I personally think that you're already in the path that you would reach that level if you ever aspire to but then coming back to the topic of Harvard specifically
right.
and you might
that's
get this
what everyone wants to talk about,
obviously right
deep down perhaps I was also hoping for you to bring it up I may not admit it but probably
right but then it's a brand that you have to talk about like every person who's interested in academics has once dreamt of getting into Harvard right so we cannot skip that topic personally and if I ever not end up getting into Harvard my defense would be and at least I had a conversation with the person who graduated from Harvard so how was the process like going to Harvard applying application
right nobody from KSL or any senior that I knew of had applied to Harvard or had been selected I didn't have that information there were seniors who had been accepted into Oxford and Cambridge. My sister herself was accepted into Oxford, but she's on a different level. She said no to Oxford and she went to Geneva. Sometimes she now regrets it because she says, brand conscious समाजमा म Oxford जानु पर्थ्यो तर कुन लेभलको उसको चेतना होला यो अक्सफोर्डको यो कोर्स भन्दा चाहिँ जेनेभा एकाडेमीको यो कोर्स राम्रो छ भनेर उसले अक्सफोर्डलाई म आउँदिन भनेर भनेको अब ह्याभिङ दोज पिपल इन द फ्यामिली मलाई पनि एउटा खालको मैले प्रेसर लिएँ त्यही भने नि अर्काको भोक मेटाइदिने युवराज सरले के भन्नुहुन्थ्यो भने अर्को साल हार्वर्ड जान्छ मैले अप्लाई गरेको पनि थाहा थिएन ही वाज भेरी कन्फिडेन्ट एन्ड माई कन्फिडेन्स वाज सेकन बिकज आई हेड अप्लाइड फर अ फुलब्राइट स्कलरसिप and I really worked hard towards it but for some reason I was kicked out of the interview round and I always thought getting a Fulbright scholarship would be easier than getting into Harvard so the goal was I had it all planned out I will apply for a Fulbright I'm not going to take my parents' money if Harvard doesn't give me a scholarship I'm going to use the Fulbright scholarship then when I didn't get the Fulbright my confidence was shaken after all these years of telling yourself no you're in a good place you're studying hard there's no difference between studying in Nepal or studying abroad after years of telling yourself that there was a rupture there that made me wonder really is it a question of a degree am I not good enough because I've done everything possible to do that because of course my teachers who pressurized me into speaking in English in school. Getting a good TOEFL score was not a problem. So see, that was the advantage. TOEFL score easily राम्रो match हुने आइहाल्यो. But when I remember December 1 was the deadline to apply to Harvard. I had been thinking in my mind, what would I tell someone who is reading my application? I had been thinking, but I didn't have the confidence. And I was someone who didn't want to lose. So I said, if I apply and if I get rejected, I probably will never have the confidence to apply again. So I just won't apply. Procrastination. Then I remember there was a moot court competition happening. The students of Nepal were also placed in Radisson. I was sitting in a cafe in Radisson, and there was one day for me to apply to Harvard. And my mother asked me very casually, have you sent in your application for Harvard? And I said, yeah, it looks like they don't do much scholarship. I'll probably apply next year. So I did everything not to apply. And she said, are you scared of applying? Are you scared you won't be selected? And I said, yeah. Just like Fulbright kicked me out, I probably won't get in. And she said, look, if you get rejected, you get rejected from Harvard. What's the big deal? And I always remember she said something like this. The answer is definitely a no if you never ask the question. I've said it so many times. So just give it a try. So she sat me down. Radisson turned out to be quite lucky. So I sat down, I wrote my essay because I'd been thinking about it. And I've thought of my life story so many times that it took me half an hour to write down a personal statement. And the question was, do I be honest about my experience or do I try to hide my legacy? My lineage, my parents being involved in setting up an institution. I decided, you know what, I'll be honest. And I wrote down with absolute honesty in my application whatever I went through. And then the question was, why should Harvard take you? And then I said, Harvard has absolutely no reason to take me. I am one among many people who probably have put in a lot of hard work. But the reason you should perhaps take me is because of my experience. I take criticisms lightly. Small ruptures don't affect me. My sister and I, we're both thick-skinned. If we can take criticisms against our parents with jest, we probably can survive at Harvard. And plus, with our moot court experience, I think international law at Harvard is going to be relatively easy. So I went in all out being vulnerable and also being confident. So the goal was to balance empathy and assertiveness. So that was the process of application. And I was lucky. I lucked out. I got selected. I do think that nothing in me was specifically unique for me to have been selected. I don't know what went through in the application selection process, but I was lucky. And do I wake up every day thinking, wow, I went to Harvard, my life is good? I don't. People forget those kind of things. They're never happy. Now, I went to Harvard is not something that gives me a source of happiness on a day-to-day level. In fact, it frustrates me sometimes because now everyone has a grand plan of how I should use that degree. Harvard gako manchile ta fill in the blanks and countless suggestions. And kaile kai ke huncha bhane Harvard gako manche la aaj ma dinbhari sutera bitaidinchu लौ जा भने I am rebelling in my own way. So we can talk about that more at a greater detail. I don't want to spill my beans because I'm hoping to write something about my experience.
Right.
So if I talk about it too much here, nobody's going to buy the book or listen to my podcast if I make any. So
True.
let's leave it at that. But it was a good experience, definitely.
Good hint about both the things.
Yeah.
I'll tune in.
Yeah.
Right, ma'am. So I wanted to get back to you on a more, something related to foreign affairs. You once hosted a show, Foreign Affairs School, right? So I believe that you're interested in Foreign Affairs School. So outright, the Russo-Ukrainian crisis, which is happening currently. And on voting patterns, which we have seen, right? Nepal got the GA, General Assembly, right? What do you think of it when we outright say that, yes, Russia is an aggressor, right? But then we also vote no for their removal from the Human Rights Council, right? How do you see it?
There are good arguments for both sides. Number one, when your neighbors don't want to take a stand, perhaps one argument is it's better to sit on the fence yourself because you're a landlocked country who has to calibrate your foreign affairs and diplomacy in line of what your neighbors are also doing. That's the practical reality. So sitting on the fence would probably also be a good idea. But then again, you could say Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall and had a great fall, right? So there's a problem when you sit on the wall too much. On the other side, if you see Nepal's positioning as being different from the neighbors, we're trying to carve out our own identity in contrast to our neighbors, to a point that the world takes notice of this country that dares to have its own foreign policy and foreign affairs independent of the neighbors. So that kind of branding might be useful to Nepal in some way. But it could also be equally disadvantageous, because then you have an obligation to be good neighbors. Certainly you can have an independent foreign policy, but realistically, if our neighbors aren't really happy with us and they think our positioning affects their national security, then the Law of the Seas Convention is of no help to us, because as a landlocked country, a coastal state can always close its borders if it affects their national security and essential interests. So I see pros and cons. Like you said, I'm an academician. I hardly give any answers. I always ask more questions. But I do say that this ongoing idea of cancelling everything Russian is something that I don't subscribe to. The idea that if you've not spoken out against Vladimir Putin, it makes you an aggressor. It reminds me of George Bush's either you're with us or you're against us. Life is never that binary. There are a lot of people who don't know what to make of that information available at that given moment.
Right.
They're not anti-Ukrainian perhaps, but they don't want to say anything because they have bills to think of, they have food to think of, they have shelter to think of.
Right.
So whoever protects them, perhaps they would take sides with them. So I don't like this idea of oversimplifying things and saying things. There's a really good documentary I saw about hatred towards Russian people outside, which I think is not fair. In any regards.
Exactly.
So that was a non-answer to your question.
Right. It was a very gloomy response.
Yeah, I mean, assuming I have to go somewhere, I don't want to compromise my chances of being appointed anywhere, right? Because of this podcast and her views on Russia and Ukraine, she's ineligible. So
Right.
Yeah.
Let me make it harder for you then. Do you see the application of international law in case of the US invasion of Iraq and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? I question if I call it invasion or special military action, but then the application in both these scenarios are pretty different, right? But then if you look at the pretext, right, you'd see that both of them did not get approval from the Security Council before doing any of it. Right, US has the pretext that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Right, Russia says that Ukrainians, they were forming this neo-Nazi group and about to attack us and things like that.
Yeah.
So, do you think international law in its application was very biased towards Russia? Also because in the international market, how countries perceive Russia is in a very negative, from a very negative lens, whatever they do, it's wrong sort of sense. So is there a sort of biasness in its application?
I think international law, particularly UN, has been equal-handed in its criticism of US and Russia. We just haven't found enough documents. They're not easily made published, but the United Nations, academics, many people have deeply criticized US for what they did with Iraq, this idea of intervention. And I think they're doing the same with Russia. The fundamental difference perhaps is the ability of international law and the rules-based world order system to impose sanctions on a particular country and isolate any country in a globalized world. I don't think the United States had to go through that kind of sanctions regime. So that's what separates Russia from US, even though the moral authority of both has been questioned one way or another. So I don't think the UN is any more biased towards Russia as it was to the US. They have some very nasty things to say about US as well and Russia as well. But something that makes me wonder, is a country self-sufficient in order to withstand sanctions? And this is an area of international law that I think students should look into. I am also particularly interested in sanctions law, how it applies, when can it apply, the legitimate and moral authority of applying sanctions, whether it be Iran, whether it be landlocked countries like Nepal through blockades, official or unofficial. How can a country ensure its national security and is able to feed its people? So I guess one way to think about it is, if tomorrow Nepal were to be sanctioned, what do we have with us that would help us withstand that sanction at least for 1 year without crumbling into pieces? Maybe that's why our leaders, one way or another, are very entertaining of the international community and human rights law. Perhaps we don't think we would stand that possibility. I think the German parliament was once going to talk about the humanitarian problem in Nepal after the unofficial border closing between India and Nepal. And then the France Bataclan Theatre massacre happened, and all the newspapers started focusing on that incident, and no one talked about the blockade at that point. So I realized then the importance of being on news, front page, for people to notice you. So perhaps Nepal is, based on its experiences, trying to make itself visible and stand out for that very reason. And we stood out for the earthquake, and we did get a lot of help. We came up, but it could be that strategy. I'm also thinking, I don't think Nepalese leaders and we're stupid and foolish. There must be something. I must give them a good faith presumption.
I do that too all the time.
Yeah.
Whenever I'm having conversations with my friend, and they're like, because our leaders are something, they just do it, and I'm just like, they're not stupid. They've done something to reach there, right? Not necessarily good or bad, but then they have done something. They know, right, what's around and things like that. So obviously they aren't stupid. They are very smart people, as a matter of fact, because they have reached such a level. But then, do you think the Russo-Ukrainian crisis has reflected that a small state is always at threat, and despite we living in a world of intergovernmental organizations such as the United Nations or the European Union, right? Nobody's safe. Everything is at threat, and if tomorrow one of our neighbors were to attack us, we would be able to do nothing, and the United Nations would, at maximum, just criticize the country, but then out on a practical level would not be able to help us.
Yeah.
Would that be?
That's why I think we should champion this cause of making our neighbors permanent, like one of our neighbors definitely permanent members of the Security Council, because with great powers come great responsibility. I, as a Nepali, would, for that very reason, to ensure my own survival and well-being, think only good of the neighbor. Because if you put them in a position where they can't act rampantly, perhaps you ensure your survival better. So if your neighbors are strong and they are well-liked, you hope that you would be treated better as well. So international... What was the question? That this is very random, but okay, here's what I wanted to say. I was noticing lately Austria and Hungary's response to the whatever you call it, invasion, annexation, integration. And I've noticed that landlocked countries, and Hungary is a landlocked country also in... Yeah, I think so. Yeah, Hungary is definitely landlocked. Landlocked smaller countries always are at a losing end whenever something like this happens. Because when all countries are all guarded and protectionist and they close down the borders, the landlocked countries have much to suffer. So if you even classify world responses into coastal versus landlocked versus climate change vulnerable countries, countries who are landlocked and who are more geographically disadvantaged perhaps have a higher stake at solving this problem. And I think countries like us should also join in the process of negotiations and arbitration, because we are definitely at the losing end whenever the global recession hits or when countries are paranoid and they close off their borders. That's what we would have to think of. Yeah.
Right. Also, in response to the current Russo-Ukrainian crisis, do you see a rise in a multipolar world order? Because a lot of countries who are a member of NATO have taken a very distinct stance, right? Germany, despite sanctioning Russia and closing down Nord 2 pipelines, right, it is still taking in fossil fuels and gas supplies, right? As a matter of fact, there was this article which says that the NATO has pumped in about $12 billion in favor of Ukraine, but they have taken goods worth of $200 billion from Russia.
Oh, that's
right?
Interesting. Yeah.
So, do you see a very eminent, visible rise of a multipolar world order? Because despite the US pushing so hard for, its NATO allies to, sanction it, stop trade and things like that, they're just standing distinct. Like in Japan the other day, the Chamber of Commerce actually protested against the government that, dare you stop trade, we'll start protesting and things like that. So, does this make the multipolar world order more evident?
I think it was already there, but this multipolarity became more visible through this situation that we have. I don't want to talk too much like an expert because I don't have a detailed understanding or even statistics like you do. But if you just simply look at some videos on YouTube that are going viral all the time, anytime any leader of a developing country, former part of the colonial world, bashing the colonial empire, bashing the West, the amount of views it gets, the amount of claps it gets, anyone who ruptures, who challenges the predominant Western colonial empire-led governance is becoming very popular. That is an evidence. For example, Foreign Minister of India, Jaishankar's video always pops up in my YouTube. I don't know how. I never subscribe to any of that, but it's just there in my algorithm. So, or when Imran Khan speaks about the colonial masters trying to depose him and all of that, it just generates a lot of public attention. It captures the public imagination because we want to feel like we're always on a fight. We're fighting the bad guy. And this, if you just look at YouTube, and everyone wants to think, okay, we're on this side and you're on that side. So this multipolarity, this bipolarity is being more visible on YouTube. Of course, I haven't done any research on it, but it seems so at a preliminary glance that people are now not afraid to talk that they're not part of the same gang. Whereas when I was growing up, it was very difficult to even talk about decolonization. I remember in jurisprudence when my father, my teacher, when he taught me, decolonization, getting rid of the colonial mindset was not a very predominant issue. People used to question him. And he used to say, I wonder if I'll ever get a visa to go to UK or USA. It was not a common thing to do at all. It is only in the after 2000s when decolonization has now become this fancy new thing. Everyone wants to talk about it. But because of this education, which happened in KSL, bringing it back to KSL, I was better able to engage even while I was doing my master's to keep your head sorted. Someone once said, keep yourself open-minded, but not so open that your brains fall out. So at some point you have to have a view.
Right. Interestingly, you bring in the question about algorithm, right?
Yeah.
And the other day, I was just thinking of it and it hit me. Because they're always listening your devices, right? So if you use an Android device, you say, hey Google, right?
Yeah.
And it activates. For that, it has to always listen, right? And the same goes with Siri. And everything has become so personalized, right? Because whatever, if I were to Google something right now, right, and I go back home, I'll see posts or articles relating to that, right? And even advertisement which will flow will be relating to that. And it really got me questioning that, this sort of distorts our view, right? Because in a manner how we see things, right? Suppose I have a view, or in general, I'm just trying to understand the other's perspective. And I Google a few things about it. Now I'm just consuming that type of information. And it got me so worried that, I started consuming information from people or on YouTube channels or videos of those people who I did not necessarily subscribe to the idea of, right? So on one hand, I'll be listening to a liberal view, right? On the other hand, I'd be going to Ben Shapiro videos and listening to him or Jordan Peterson, right? Just to balance it out, because or else I feel like Unsani, if we just consume one particular type of views, right, it just makes us so unlearned. जस्तो लाग्छ क्या. And the YouTube algorithm or any algorithm in general is just advancing this भनेर क्या. Do you see that as a problem?
Absolutely. In my case, just harkening back to the getting off the social media thing, I think I have left very little digital footprint now. So I still feel I have more control over what gets recommended to me. Because I'm not on Facebook, Instagram. So I feel I've protected myself from that. But I think what you do is great. Just consciously seeking out views from the other side, always asking why, is a great idea. I do listen to all of those people that you mentioned. But the problem is, again, as a teacher in class, when you're trying to introduce to your students something, students tend to believe that if you give them a certain reading material, you are endorsing it. And I want to break that barrier. If I want to introduce a very polarizing kind of article, just for the sake of academic discussion, curating a material is not endorsing. Just like people in Twitter said, just forwarding a tweet is not endorsing it. So I think that is something we need to all be conscious about. And at least through this platform, I want all my students and my colleagues to know that there may be moments where you feel like, am I trying to put forward a certain propaganda, a certain narrative by selecting a certain kind of case or a reading material? Then you should be assured that I'm doing everything I can to counter that selection bias by making sure if I give you something, I'm also giving you something else to think about.
Right. So coming on the ending part, like Siddhon like so
that felt so short, right?
Sorry?
We've been going on for hours probably, but it felt short.
It did, well over an hour. So on an ending note, I'd like to ask you is one book that you want to recommend to our viewers.
Oh, right now. So we had a conversation about this before this podcast. I am still reading it. But I already recommended is the a short novel called The Fall by Albert Camus, a greatly known philosopher, won a lot of Nobel Literature Prizes, this would be interesting for law students, particularly because the protagonist, the character, is a lawyer himself who has fallen from grace. He was a well-known public interest lawyer who did everything right, was the voice of the voiceless, speaking for the poor, and was winning prizes for that. And how Jean-Baptiste Clémence, the protagonist, starts reflecting on whether he was in fact doing anything of that, or was he performing it for the sake of an audience? Going back to the validation part we started with. That's, I think, that one book that I will recommend. And because I'm a teacher, I always give a backup optional reading as well. After you read that, there's also a good book called The Drama of the Gifted Child by a psychotherapist analyst called Alice Miller, which will tell you how childhood memories impact your adulthood. So your experiences as a child, you cannot neglect that, and how it's probably affecting you right now as you're seated in front of me, your relationship with your mother primarily. That's a great read for everyone.
Right. Okay. Next question. This is very random, but
I know someone's going to say, why didn't you recommend Nepali book?
True. That's certainly going to happen. I believe that it is. But then moving on to the next question, can we see you in a political position ever?
I have no ambitions. I think now, I thought I was very well suited to be in a public office, but I don't think my qualities that I've gained now, based on my experiences, will help me survive as a politician. Therefore, I have a lot of respect for any politician in general, because it's very difficult to work with a team who probably who don't share your vision, who are probably just there for entertainment, who are there because they're frustrated and they want to shake things up. To work with a big team is always more difficult than working solo. So I don't know. I feel ill-suited to be that because I hardly give you any answers, right? There's always the other side. So
true.
it's better just to do things in a genuine, honest manner wherever you are. I think if you are a teacher, if you teach well all your life, that's also a public good. And that should be valued.
Last question and then we'll end this.
Yeah.
Despite not having political ambitions, if you were the Prime Minister of our country today, what's the one thing that you would want to do or target?
Wow, I have never, can you believe that? I've never thought of this, the answer to this question. That's a great question. If I were the Prime Minister of this country, what would I do?
Yeah.
I would admit that I probably don't have any answer to this question. I would bring people who probably have good suggestions for me and just admit and say, look, I became the Prime Minister, but I have no clue how to run things. I've been a great freedom fighter. I've been a great struggler, but I don't know what to do with peace. Right. So do tell me, is what I would ask.
That's a very intellectual answer. Thank you so much, ma'am, for tuning in with us, and it was wonderful having a conversation with you. I hope that we're able to do this again.
Yeah, likewise.
And thank you so much for having me.
I must say I enjoyed it much more than I thought I would.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, that's an honest feedback.
Before we ended, was there a particular question you would have wanted me to ask which I did not ask, or any way that I
think you covered everything pretty well.
Thank you.
The Russia-Ukraine thing was foisted on me, just so the audience knows. I did no advanced preparation for this. But anyways, it was really good chatting with you, Syed.
Thank you.
And I hope you have a good day.
Thank you, ma'am. You too. Hope you have a beautiful day ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And thanks to our technical help, Akrit,
right.
who's here working in the margins like our mothers.
Right.
We must recognize the invisible labor here. Akrit.
Thank you so much.
Okay.